What does it really mean to live a good life, not just a pleasant day or a lucky week? We chase comfort and status and distraction, yet the question keeps knocking like a polite but persistent guest. Is the good life a feeling, a scoreboard, or a way of being that survives our moods and headlines? People have asked this for more than 2,000 years, and every era answers in its own accent. In the 4th century before the Common Era, Aristotle offered a durable reply with the word eudaimonia, the flourishing of a life well lived. He framed it not as a mood, but as a practice, cultivated by virtue over seasons rather than snatched in moments. Virtue sounded like practical wisdom to his students in Athens, because it meant learning to choose well under pressure and over time. You build courage by doing courageous things, and you build honesty by telling the truth when it costs you something. A generation later, and for centuries afterward, Roman thinkers carried these ideas forward by adding discipline and steadiness to the recipe. They taught that character is a craft, and a craft is shaped by daily work more than by rare inspiration. Through the medieval centuries, the language tilted toward the spiritual, yet the spine of the idea stayed intact. A good life was still imagined as formation rather than sensation, a training of the heart so that freedom could serve the good. By the early modern period, voices turned toward individual conscience and civic responsibility, expanding the stage on which virtue could play. The theme endured across upheavals and empires, because a life is not found but formed, patiently, like a garden learning its weather. Fast forward to the 20th century, when psychology rose as a science and asked whether flourishing could be studied with evidence as well as with philosophy. The question did not cancel Aristotle. It updated the instruments used to explore the same north. Let us gather these centuries into 3 dimensions that braid into a strong rope across time. The first strand is virtue, the cultivated capacity to align actions with values even when nobody is watching. The second strand is meaning, the sense that your time fits into a story larger than personal convenience. The third strand is balance between self and community, a rhythm that lets you grow roots and share fruit. In Aristotle's day, virtue began in public squares where reputation mattered, and choices were visible. Today it still begins in private rooms where no crowd will applaud, because character grows where excuses hide. Think of a craftsperson in ancient Athens, sanding a rough edge each morning on a stone for a temple wall. The shine arrives only after many passes, and the mason's hands teach the mind what patience actually feels like. Likewise, a person becomes generous by practicing generosity in ways that feel almost laughably small at first. Leave the last pastry for someone else, send the encouraging note, and keep the promise no one could enforce. These micro-choices seem trivial, yet they teach the nervous system a new default and redraw the map of who you are. Habits become the rails on which character rides, and rails are laid one plank at a time. Education in this tradition is less about information and more about formation. It is about shaping desire so that you can love what is truly good and refuse what only glittered. You do not become brave to earn applause. You become brave so you can do worthy things when fear arrives. Once you taste the steadiness of virtue, you realize it protects joy rather than strangling it. Joy without virtue is like sugar without nutrition, because it spikes and delights, and then leaves you strangely empty. That is why hedonism, though tempting in every century, has never been enough to carry a whole life. Meaning, our second strand, grew alongside virtue as societies widened and stories multiplied. Where does my effort go? And who benefits when I spend this hour, this week, this season of my life? Modern language calls this purpose and coherence, but the question is old and stubborn. The thread runs from Aristotle's telos to today's talk of mission, asking whether your days fit into a narrative you can endorse. Across the last 100 years, researchers have followed people into midlife and old age to see what endures. The signal keeps repeating that people thrive when they belong somewhere and contribute to something that matters. If virtue is the engine, meaning is the destination, and both need fuel that community often provides. Balance between self and community does not mean splitting attention evenly, but letting each side enrich the other. You tend your inner garden so you can share fruit, and you share fruit so your garden keeps receiving rain. Isolation starves meaning while constant people-pleasing starves integrity, and a good life refuses both extremes. The tension has shown up in every century because humans always live among other humans. Consider a young consultant in the early 21st century, offered a prestigious promotion that requires endless travel and work that feels hollow. The prestige sparkles like a trophy, yet something inside whispers that excellence without purpose will curdle into regret. If she turns it down, friends might question her ambition, and if she accepts her own voice, might go quiet. The choice is not career versus leisure, but prestige versus purpose, a test of meaning and virtue intertwined. A good life decision often looks costly in the short term and liberating in the long term. Another person stands between comfort and excellence, deciding whether to train seriously for a craft or remain pleasantly average. Excellence asks for discomfort, repetition, boredom, and failures that bruise the ego but strengthen the spine. Comfort asks for little and returns little, like a soft chair that eventually molds your posture toward sleep. The good life is not a punishment of comfort, but the wise trading of lesser comforts for deeper satisfactions. When you choose excellence in service of values, the discomfort becomes meaningful rather than merely painful. That is the kind of meaning that outlasts a mood and matures into pride without arrogance. History shows that cultures have always tied the good life to some mix of virtue and meaning. Our century adds a new stage and new tools, but the plot remains recognizably human. This is why the old language of Eudaimonia still speaks across time like a lighthouse on a rocky coast. It points not to a single destination, but to a seasoned way of traveling. Modern psychology, rising across the 20th century, added measurements and experiments to the old question of the good life. Early in that century, the focus tilted toward illness and repair, but by mid-century, a humanistic turn began asking how people could grow. By the late 1970s and 80s, researchers proposed a simple triad for flourishing that echoed ancient wisdom. They argued that autonomy, mastery, and relatedness are basic needs, because we do better when choices feel ours, skills improve, and bonds are warm. Notice how this map rhymes with our three strands, since autonomy supports virtue, mastery deepens meaning, and relatedness sustains balance. Meanwhile, another line of inquiry described flow, the state where challenge and skill meet so well that time thins and attention steadies. Then, in the late 1990s, a new banner called Positive Psychology gathered these threads and asked how to build well-being on purpose. It did not reject pleasure. It set pleasure beside engagement and meaning so that joy could be companion rather than compass. Across these decades, one long-running study begun in the late 1930s kept returning the same lesson about adulthood. Not income spikes or perfect resumes, but warm relationships predicted thriving, and the pattern held into old age. If you want a good life, become a good friend, a good partner, and a good neighbor, because connection multiplies every other good. Let us anchor the abstract with a modern example from the 2010s, when smartphones swallowed attention like a pocket-sized black hole. A software engineer felt constantly tugged by notifications, tempted by prestige projects, and drained by invisible expectations. He began a practice of phone-free dinners, weekly walks with a friend, and a thoughtful limit on weekend work. The result was not sainthood but steadiness, and steadiness let meaning grow roots instead of skimming the surface. With these stories in mind, a fair critique of hedonism becomes clear without condemning pleasure at all. Pleasure is wonderful when it follows virtue and meaning, like warm sunlight after a hike through worthy terrain. But when we chase pleasure as the path, the hike becomes a loop in a parking lot, scenic but directionless. The correction is not denial but order, placing values first, relationships close, and comforts where they belong as dessert. Yet danger lurks on the opposite ridge, where perfectionism turns living into a permanent audit. Perfectionism disguises itself as ambition, but often grows from fear. The fear of being unworthy unless everything is immaculate. The good life is not flawless performance, it is faithful participation, showing up with honesty and learning in public. In practice, that means forgiving yourself for missed steps while returning to the rhythm you chose on purpose. Excellence without self-compassion snaps like a tight wire, but excellence with kindness becomes a stringed instrument that can sing. So how do we build this life without turning it into another heavy project in a crowded calendar? Start with a short list of values that feel like home, words you could defend even on a tired day. Translate each value into one daily action you can actually do, something small enough to repeat without theatrics. Courage might become one difficult conversation each week, and gratitude might become a simple thank you note before bed. Purpose might become a standing hour for deep work on what you secretly know matters most. Next, invite accountability that feels like friendship rather than surveillance, because community is fertilizer for virtue and meaning. Share your intentions with someone you trust and ask for theirs, then check in with grace rather than judgment. Celebrate tiny wins out loud, because what we praise tends to grow, and what grows tends to endure. When setbacks arrive, as they always do, review the process rather than attacking your identity. You are not broken, you are learning. And learning looks messy up close while beautiful from a distance. Picture your life as a garden that needs daily cultivation, rather than heroic rescue missions after months of neglect. Virtue is the soil you amend, meaning is the crop you chose, and balance is the pattern of watering and weeding. Some seasons will be rainy, and some dry, and no harvest stands forever, which is why tending matters more than trophies. You cannot force fruit, but you can honor the conditions that make fruit more likely over time. A gardener measures success by care given and growth encouraged, not by envy of a neighbor's perfect photograph. Across the timeline from Aristotle to late 20th century psychology and into the digital present, the melody has stayed consistent. We were built to practice strengths, to serve stories larger than ourselves, and to belong to one another in ways that let us both give and receive. That melody can guide everyday decisions about work, relationships, and personal growth, without turning life into a grim duty. Return to our consultant and imagine her choosing purpose over prestige, because the calendar of her future deserves projects worth the hours. She may lose applause in the short run, yet she gains a cohesion that money cannot buy, and the gain compounds across years. Return to our engineer and imagine him protecting attention, as if it were the topsoil of his mind. He will not win every day, yet his small routines will stack into a sturdier identity and a quieter kind of joy. So ask yourself a few questions that only you can answer with the quiet authority of your own experience. Which pleasures bring you alive and which merely numb you? And how can you reorder them to serve your values? Where do your talents meet a real need in the world? And how might you devote more of your best hours there? Who are the people with whom you can practice truth and warmth? And what small act would deepen those bonds this week? In the next part, we will extend this timeline into concrete practices for the months ahead, tracing how daily choices accumulate into a life that feels whole. Until then, let this be an invitation, gentle but firm, to keep cultivating a life that is good, not by accident, but by design. This final part turns the big ideas into a calendar you can live, because a philosophy only matters when it changes what you do with a day. We have followed the thread from Aristotle's virtue to modern psychology's flourishing, and now we stitch it into time. Think of a life measured not just by achievements but by rhythm, by the steady cadence of actions that make sense together. We will move from a single day to a week, then a season, a year, and finally the arc of a decade. Each horizon asks a different question and offers a different lever. Day protects attention, week builds relationships and skill, season drives projects, year shapes identity, and decade reveals the story. When these layers cooperate, you get traction instead of noise. Begin with a day, the smallest stage on which meaning can actually act. A useful day has 3 anchors that honor virtue, meaning, and balance. In the morning, choose one intention that would make the day worth having lived even if everything else slips. In your peak work hour, move one hard thing forward that serves a value you can name out loud. In the evening, repair a relationship by a small act of warmth or honesty, because belonging closes the loop on effort. A mid-20th century psychiatrist learned in brutal conditions that between stimulus and reaction, there is a small freedom to choose. That gap is where virtue lives, and a good day is simply many practiced visits to that gap. If you miss it at noon, you can still find it at 5, and mercy for yourself keeps the door unlocked. Shift to the week, because meaning grows roots when repeated in cycles large enough to notice but small enough to steer. Choose a weekly craft session where mastery can accumulate, whether it is writing, coding, teaching, cooking, or patient practice in your trade. Pair it with a social ritual that is easy to keep, like a dinner without phones or a standing walk with a friend. Close the week with a short review that asks what moved the needle on values, what frayed connection, and what you will try differently next week. This cadence keeps perfectionism quiet, because feedback arrives as guidance rather than judgment. Now consider the season, roughly 3 months, long enough to build something real and short enough to start again soon. Pick one meaningful project that scares you a little, and define progress as a series of visible milestones, not an all-or-nothing finale. In this window, expect boredom and resistance because excellence often feels like slowly chopping wood that no one else hears. A striking scientific case shows why seasons of deliberate practice matter for the brain, as well as the resume. Researchers studying London taxi drivers found that mastering a complex city map was linked with structural changes in the brain's navigation system, skill-shaped tissue and tissue-shaped confidence, which is why sustained focus can feel like laying track for a larger self. The yearly horizon invites you to shape identity, to decide who you are becoming rather than only what you are producing. Choose a theme that answers a real need, such as becoming a steadier parent, a more present leader, or a kinder partner. Let the theme choose the habits, the readings, the mentors, and the retreats, not the other way around. At year's end, write a one-page letter to your future self about what mattered, what hurt, and what you hope to attempt next. Across a decade, the pattern tells a story that random pleasures never could. Compounding appears in character the way it appears in finance, slow at first and then surprisingly generous. A decade is where sustained service becomes legacy, where today's small kindness ripens into trust you never imagined needing. To see these horizons working together, picture a young nurse in a busy city hospital who faces a glittering offer to move into management. The raise is real, but the role would pull her from the bedside where purpose feels most alive for her. She declines the title, keeps 3 long shifts, spends 1 weekly block studying advanced cardiac care, and sets a seasonal goal to qualify for a critical unit. Her year becomes the year of competence and compassion, and by decade's end she has trained dozens, comforted thousands, and still likes the person she is becoming. Now meet a mid-career software founder who has grown weary of building products that harvest attention while starving meaning. He sells a stake in the company, funds 2 years of runway, and commits to a product that reduces digital overload inside schools. Days are about deep work sprints. Weeks include teacher interviews and student pilots. Seasons turn features into a working tool, and the year becomes a public launch shaped by real classrooms. His decade reads as a portfolio of service, and the prestige he once chased quietly follows the purpose he finally chose. Common mistakes return on every horizon, and the remedy is almost always gentler than we expect. If hedonism pulls you off track, add meaning before you subtract pleasure, because order heals faster than austerity. If perfectionism freezes you, shrink the task until momentum restarts, because movement teaches the mind that safety and growth can share a room. Hold the whole model as a garden calendar rather than a checklist. Days are the watering, weeks are the pruning, seasons are the plantings, years are the trellises, and decades are the shade the next generation will enjoy. Weather will come, yet a gardener learns to work with it, to move tasks earlier or later, and to stay kind when hail has the last word. As you look ahead, which horizon needs your attention first? The day that keeps slipping, the week that loses people, the season that stalls, or the year that lacks a name? Who could walk beside you so that practice feels like companionship rather than penance? And what would be the smallest next step that you would not dread? May this timeline help you tend a life that is not just full, but alive. And may it invite you back for the next conversation we will keep unfolding together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Remember this as you go. A good life isn't a destination. It is a daily choice.